Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Pardon me. I hope you're all doing very well on this lovely UK day. And for those of you that are in the southern hemisphere, going into your winter, sorry for you. But we are currently basking in the glory that is spring up here in the UK, which is absolutely marvelous. Unfortunately, because of this viral stupidity, we are all having to be forced to sit indoors. Nevertheless, doesn't mean we cannot still exercise our minds and think about certain things. It's definitely become apparent to me that people have had more time on their hands on the internet of late, because this has kind of worked in favor for my channel, because I've got like new subscribers and all of that sort of thing, and people are actually watching more than just the first 5 minutes of a video, which is quite interesting. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk to you guys today about the mind brain interaction, whether we have free will and all of these kinds of things, because one of the big challenges that has been posted by materialism is that the mind and you as there is essentially not really any such thing as you as an individual. There's no metaphysical reality to you. Everything boils down to atoms in the void, and all mental properties and so on and so forth can be reduced down to mere physical things. And there have been some experiments and things of that sort over the last 30, 40, 50 years and so on and so forth, even before that have been very, very interesting, and have which seem to have encouraged the materialist view, even though, strangely enough, not a single one of these experiments, as far as I can tell, should be encouraging to any materialist whatsoever. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, if any materialist actually was not holding onto materialism by faith, by blind faith, they would have abandoned the concept of materialism quite long ago. Interesting thing, though, that you are seeing is that people are, what I am seeing, personally at least, is they're beginning to redefine what they mean by material. And as is common to the modern world, especially people like social justice warriors and stuff like that, this trend of simply redefining what words mean has become very, very popular, because rather than actually change one's mind on a particular subject, instead people want to pig-headedly continue holding to a particular ideology or philosophy, and in order to force fit their philosophy into the world, they instead prefer to redefine their words and redefine terms to the point where the words eventually become completely and utterly meaningless and don't actually describe anything whatsoever. One of my favorite examples was a gentleman called Lawrence Krauss, who was a professor of physics, in a debate with William Lane Craig, who basically who basically went after William Craig and basically says to him, you don't, when talking about up and down, you don't simply redefine what is meant by up. And yet he is too blind and idiotic to realize that throughout the entire discussion, throughout the entire debate, he basically redefined what the word nothing meant. And so this is very much the sort of hypocrisy and stupidity that you get, and just asineity that you get within this particular debate. So I was actually asked by an individual a little while back to actually, because he said that he couldn't find a lot on this particular subject. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just put in the description of this video, I'm going to put a whole bunch of resources for you guys to go and have a read and see what's going on there, and videos and all that kind of stuff. Dr. Craig did a nice video where he talks about the quantum physics and speed of light and how that could explain certain things and stuff like that. There's another gentleman called Michael Egnor. There's a gentleman called Robert Marx, and all of these guys, very, very brilliant individuals who really, I think, sort of lay these sorts of issues to rest and all that sort of thing. And I'm going to attempt to dilute all of that to you for you guys today on the question of mind and all that sort of thing, because essentially what you have is on two, you essentially have, as always, you have two different extremes, where if you look at if you basically look at materialists, so if you sort of think of the whole question as like a continuum, right? On the one extreme you have the idea that we're only that we're basically only spiritual, or only metaphysical, sort of thing, and the body is basically can just be discarded, sort of thing. You have that on that the body is basically irrelevant. You've got that on the one extreme, and then again then on the other extreme you have materialism, and they basically are willing to discard the mind and or the soul altogether, sort of thing. And then as far as I'm concerned, the only sanity that can be found is here, is in the middle, where is where the most reasonable place seems to be. And this is not because it's trying to be conciliatory, but this is actually because if it follows the evidence, as far as I'm concerned. Now on this side of things, the sort of the spiritual side, you have some Christians, you do see some tendency within Christendom for people to treat the body like it's completely irrelevant, especially those who will, for example, deny the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ outright, and sort of believe that it is not necessary. And then also those people who sort of believe that when you die you go straight to heaven, and even though your body is rotting. And so there is that, and this view is a lot more common, this idea that when you die you then go and sort of sit on Abraham's lap in heaven as some spirit, and you basically leave the body behind as some sort of discarded thing, as if it's basically unnecessary, really, if you take it to its logical conclusion. And then that idea basically makes the whole concept of a resurrection actually quite a bit redundant, sort of thing, if that's the case. And then also generally, if you think about spiritualism and your sort of pagan religions that sort of sit on this extreme end, where the body is basically just is as discardable as, let's say, your mode of transport, for example. It's basically just a vessel, and you can discard it at will, and the spirit carries on, and the body is essentially irrelevant. And then again, on the materialist side, you have then the idea that there is no such thing as spirit, soul, mind, free will, and all of these kinds of things, that these things are essentially illusory. And one of the strange things is that, and now anyone who is experienced with presuppositionalism will have an absolute field day with both of these worldviews, especially the materialist worldview, because they'll basically say that all of this is an illusion, at which point you ask the question, well, if there is no mind or anything like that, then what is it that's having the illusion? If you are, basically, if this reduces, then you as an individual, as a free will, rational individual, don't exist, sort of thing. You're just you might as well be a rock, essentially. And so then if they say, well, it's all an illusion, well, then what is it that's having the illusion? What is it that's experiencing the illusion, right? And so obviously that whole thing reduces to absurdity. And so the Christianity specifically, which is why I'm a Christian, and my view lies right here in the middle, and this is usually where you find the dualists of some description. Now, dualism is sort of an umbrella term, because how people actually parse it out in terms of all of the little minutiae can vary quite a bit. But the basic thesis is that we are an interaction between something spiritual, something metaphysical, and something physical, and then that produces what we are, sort of thing. So the biblical view, essentially, which if those of you that might have seen my previous videos, at least the view that I espouse and all that kind of thing, is a very simple formula derived from Genesis, where you basically have breath right? Breath and dust, right? This is when God formed Adam, and with these things, and then the Bible or Genesis says, and then man becomes a living soul. So then becomes a living soul after the combination of breath and dust, so that the living soul aspect is almost like an emergent phenomena, right? So essentially like the materialist problem, or that I would say is something that is known as the fallacy of composition. Fallacy of composition basically says that whatever makes up something is identical to the thing itself, right? So essentially materialists are saying, they sort of look at our physical bodies and our physical brains and all these things, and they basically say that then we're nothing but physical, and as a result discard the idea of anything that is metaphysical and stuff like that. And if this is true, then obviously materialism is completely false. And that's actually sort of comes up, and it does seem to be a sort of fallacious idea, even just a priori. That why is it that you would, unless you had evidence to that effect, why would you assume that because we seem to be physical, and we are physical, of course, that then that's all it is, and everything must be reduced to that? Not at all. So in this sense, where you have breath and dust becomes a living soul, and this sort of the living soul is almost like an emergent phenomena, or something different that is more than just the sum of the two parts, right? And so essentially you've got a concept, a similar concept is something, for example, if you take oh, well, that's the wrong lid on the wrong thing, isn't it? So for example, you take H2O. So you've got the combination of hydrogen, 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen, and then you basically get a substance, right, which is water, right? Which is the combination of two gases, and then the subsequent compound behaves nothing like its constituent parts at all, right? So for example, hydrogen would be highly flammable, right? You wouldn't want to mess around with hydrogen at all, and then you wouldn't want to mess around with oxygen either, right? And yet if all you knew about water, let's say you knew nothing about water at all, right? Really, absolutely, you've never seen water before, you have no idea what water is, you've got no concept at all. All you knew about water, right, was that it was made up out of these two gases. And then someone came and said to you, listen, in order to put out a fire, you need to throw this on the fire. The person would look at you as if you've gone insane, right? They would expect an explosion of some sort, or to aggravate the fiery conditions, right? And so you could, in this sense, by looking at the constituent parts, you cannot determine what's actually going to be sort of the outcome there, right? And then and then my thesis as well is similar. My view of human beings is very similar, right? For example, and you've got to bear this in mind. Please watch my other videos on this, where I talk about body, soul, hypostasis, and all these kinds of things. My view then is that the living soul, and it's, like I said, is similar to the Orthodox view, how they sort of pass these things out and stuff like that. And then obviously Adventists have a similar but not as explicit way of viewing this, is that the human being has got a nature, right, or essence, right? Essence has got a nature or essence, right? And then you as an individual, right, as the individual, so here's the human, one human, another human, right? We all share the same nature or the same essence. And then human beings, so that's me, that's you, that's your neighbor, that's whatever, right? The hypostasis, right? And then our will, the will, is anchored. Remember, if for those of you that might have watched that, maybe it might be a good idea to watch that video first, right? Where basically the will comes from our nature, is property to the nature. We have a fallen nature, right? We have a fallen nature, and then the will, and your hypostatic manifestation, your body, is almost like a prism through which the human will refracts, right? And because every human being is different, the will manifests itself in a slightly different way, which is otherwise known as your personality and your individual sort of way and stuff like that. So the sort of the metaphysical part as well as the physical part are very, very closely intertwined. If you get rid of one, you get rid of the other, right? So for example, if there was no such thing as humans, right, then there would be no such thing as human nature or essence either, right? It's both the same thing. And then when we look at Jesus Christ's incarnation, right, we see that Christ was born and had a physical body, right? So Christ, so if we look at Christ, right, we see that Christ already has a divine essence, right? Christ is already the hypostatic manifestation of the person called Christ, right? And he shares the same divine essence with the Godhead. So God the Father, God the Son, and Holy Spirit all share the same divine essence, right? Even though they are distinct and metaphysically separate and metaphysically distinct entities, right? So, and then Christ, on taking on human nature, right, had to manifest physically, right? Because you take on the nature, you take on the on everything that's proper to that nature, which is then part of the physical body as well. Christ didn't just take on the human, the sort of ethereal human nature, right? He actually became physical, right? Which is probably why. So for example, could Christ have simply just appeared as a baby right on Mary's doorstep? Or you could have done that, right? But instead, Christ, Mary fell pregnant and Christ was born and went through the whole process, right? That all humans do. Okay. And that's how the body came, which then can lead one to believe that the theophanies, theophanies, or the physical manifestations, of Jesus Christ before his birth, as well as that of the angels who could appear in a physical form, it probably means that there is a significant difference between the body, that body, and then that body, right? If in order to become truly human, Christ had to actually be born, right? Take on human nature and be born. It means that if we look at the theophanies, when Christ and all the angels appeared in physical form, that physical form is different in quite a significant way from human beings, from the kind of physical way that human beings have. And there's a completely different kind of nature, or completely different sort of thing going on there, right? Which is why the whole concept of the Nephilim, of basically angels having sex with human beings and having children, is completely ridiculous, right? Just because they can manifest physically does not mean that they share that they have the necessary sort of things, constituents, in order to make that happen correctly, because we are completely different kinds of beings. I mean, but people are basically assuming that would be possible at all. And then also, if that is in fact the case, then Christ's birth is not something that is actually something that's particularly novel, right? If fallen angels have been producing children, so uniting a supernatural being with a human being, already since time immemorial, then what happened with Jesus Christ being born is nothing particularly miraculous or interesting or even new, right? It's happened before. And so that whole Nephilim thing, I think, gets shot down in this as well. So now that I've introduced you to that, right? I'm sorry that it's taken such a long introduction, but these things can be necessary to sort of give the background. Now, when we look at the scientific sort of thing, so a lot of these objections have come out through neuroscience and all that kind of stuff. Now, when we look at neurosciences in the past, say 100 years, right, there's been some very, very interesting developments. So, for example, when we do sort of open brain surgery, okay, it now wants to fail on me. All right, so I'll just use another one. So we wanna do open brain surgery, all right? Right. What have the doctors been finding when they're doing an open brain surgery? So they open the brain and they start prodding around, okay, to see what is going on. Now, what they found is that all of our motor functions and things of that, there are many functions that have discrete areas in the brain that if you stimulate that, you can induce certain things. So for example, if I poke over there, the arm goes up, you can elicit memories, you can make a person smell something that is not there, you can even make a person see something that is not there, and all of these sorts of things. But one thing that they have found is that what they could not do is actually influence the individual's consciousness. So for example, if they stimulated a person's arm to move, so they ask a question, right, I move your arm, right, I move arm, all right, so the physician goes in there, right, and presses and locates the place for arm movement, right, and stimulator. Now the individual can't see what the physician is doing, right? He has no visual access to what the physician is doing, right? So the physician goes to the part where and makes the individual's arm move, right? And then the physician asks the person who did it, who moved your arm, right? At every single point, the individual knew whether it was they that did it or whether it was the physician that did it. So if the physician goes and pokes there and their arm jumps up and the physician says, who did that? Every single time they say to the physician, that was you. You did that. It wasn't me, right? And this is supported by quite a wide variety of then other things, right? They could never simulate agency, all right? Right, they could never simulate agency, could never do it, right? Was impossible. The individual could always tell whether they were the ones that induced something or whether it was induced outside by some sort of a outer influence, right? Now, and so there's that thing that they found. No matter what they induced, they could never actually affect the individual. They couldn't actually access the individual's mind, and all of that sort of thing. Another interesting thing, right? So they were unable to simulate agency. They were absolutely unable to do that, right? And then there were some other experiments where they went in to do surgery because of people that have epilepsy, right? So what they do, right, is if with an epileptic person, what they sometimes do is they perform something that is called a corpus. It's not colostomy. Basically what they do is they bifurcate. So your brain has got two sections. So we all know, we've all seen the images where the person's brain has got two lobes, right, essentially. And what there is there's fibers in the middle that are connecting the two hemispheres of the brain. So what they do is they basically cut that so that the two brains are no longer connected, right? Because what happens is the seizure, whatever the case might be, starts from one end and then migrates over to the other end. So the person has this massive seizure, and by severing that connection between the two, they discovered that, right, the person then feels a very, very significant improvement in the obviously in the seizures go away, and there's an improvement in that entire thing. Now here's the interesting thing, is they've bifurcated the brain. Now here's the interesting thing, if they've bifurcated the brain, right, why do you never produce two people, right? It's still one person. You still have one person. And what they also found, very, very interestingly enough, is that there was absolutely no discernible difference in the person as an individual as a whole, right? Very, very, very slight, very mild differences have been discovered, right? The individual who discovered the differences actually won a Nobel Prize, right? But the differences were so exceptionally small and subtle that the process of discovering them was so ridiculous that it warranted a Nobel Prize. So bifurcating the brain does not produce two people, right? Does not produce two people at all, right? So what does this demonstrate, right? If you've bifurcated the brain, and you get people, for example, who have survived massive accidents and things like that, where massive portions of the brain can actually be lost, so they can actually lose almost the entirety of one of their hemispheres, and they can still perform as a single individual. And then in situations like that, where a person's got the two hemispheres, but it can be bifurcated, split in two, and it doesn't produce another personality or another individual, right? So what does this actually then demonstrate? If you can do all these things to the brain and it doesn't affect the individual, what it shows is that the mind is metaphysically simple. The mind is metaphysically simple, right? What that means is that, so for example, one of Richard Dawkins' objections to posing God as an explanation, right? So, for example, let's say you take the Kalam cosmological argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause, and so on and so forth, and the cause of everything was God. And now Richard Dawkins, one of his primary objections to that is that for the materialist, they have this insistence that things need to go from simple to complex, right? And his problem is that to postulate an agent as the first cause is to violate this principle, and it is to postulate something more complex, right? So this sort of thing would actually deny that sort of thing, that an agent or a mind is actually metaphysically simple, right? Even though the brain is the single most complicated thing that we've ever studied. There is nothing in the universe as complicated as the brain, right? It's ridiculous. It's unbelievable. We probably know 10%, if that, of what there is to know, probably less, of what the brain actually does. And there's constantly new things. Actually, we probably know at best probably 5% of what there is to know about the brain. It is obscenely complex. However, the mind, right, and God, we would generally say, in terms of apologetics, God is being a spiritual being. He's unembodied, as it were, right? So to postulate God as an agent at the beginning of as the first cause is in fact not to the same thing as is actually not a postulation of an increasing complexity necessarily at all. So that basically refutes what Richard Dawkins actually says. And then the experiments and stuff like that we find demonstrated that it does seem that the mind is metaphysically simple. However, even though you cannot induce the person or the personality, you cannot affect them physically by actually messing with the brain at all, you can nevertheless. So you've got a disorder that is known basically as I forget the term. Right, I'm gonna just say it by the old term, which is outdated now. It's basically multiple personality disorder. Multiple personality disorder, where it seems like you have more than one individual inside the brain, and this is one of the most interesting things that there is. And this would then and this has people should actually study this to see what does this mean. The thing is, you cannot cause this through physical means. You can only cause this through psychological means, and psychological means are immaterial. Essentially, you cannot cause multiple personality disorder by messing with the brain, with the physical with the physical parts of the body. It cannot be done. It can only be done psychologically, right? Psychological trauma, etc., etc. But so things like, so when we talk about things like abuse, rape, beating up, physical abuse, all these kinds of things, verbal abuse, psychological torture and stuff like that, even though these things are applied to the body, right, they're psychological in nature, right? You're not actually, you know, if I beat you up or if I rape you or whatever, I'm not touching the brain directly, sort of thing. These are all psychologically, so it's the individual as they perceive the situation. It actually has far less to do with the body than it does with what is going on in the mind. And so this can only be caused metaphysically through trauma and stuff like that, psychologically. But if I tamper with the brain, I cannot cause this, right? It's impossible to actually cause this disorder, right? And then also, does this then refute the idea that the mind is metaphysically simple? No, it doesn't, because what happens is that all the personalities are actually the same person, but it's the person has partitioned different memories, so that those memory partitions almost take on a personality of their own, but it's actually all the same person, and it's sort of a kind of defense mechanism and stuff like that. So and then through therapy and stuff like that, all of that eventually then collapses back into a single individual, where all the memories reintegrate and all that sort of thing. So I would not say that actually violates the idea that the mind is metaphysically simple. Now, another thing also, what they discovered with epilepsy, right? With epilepsy, right? So, for example, epilepsy as a overall blanket term. So basically, all your convulsions, all of your tics, all of your involuntary movements, and under this, I would even put other disorders such as Tourette's. Things such as Tourette's and all of these kinds of things. Well, I've got this. It's a pain in the backside. Actually, it's a pain in everything. But what they found, right, something you never get, right, is intellectual seizures. This never happens, right? Intellectual seizures. First of all, if they prod your mind, so they can make your arms move, they can elicit smells, they can elicit memories, they can elicit visions, sort of hallucinations, make your mind move, and do all of these kinds of things. But one thing they can never do is poke your brain and make you start doing calculus, or make you start ruminating on the philosophy of Epicurus or Aristotle. They can never do that, right? And they've discovered, and they've asked why. There's no such thing as intellectual seizures. They don't exist. No one has a seizure and starts preaching a sermon, or starts expounding Einstein's theory of relativity, or starts thinking about legal jurisprudence, for example. They don't. Intellectual seizures do not exist. And if the mind and the intellect could in fact be reduced down to nothing but the material, nothing but materialism, then this should happen, right? It should happen, but it can't, and it should be able to be induced. Can't be done. It's never been done, right? And it doesn't exist. There are absolutely no examples of this whatsoever. So that is something that is very, very interesting as well. You know, just by looking at seizures and looking at various disorders and stuff like that, we see that they are never, ever, ever intellectual in nature. They are only mechanical in nature. That's all they ever are, right? The intellectual is never is not affected. Now, obviously, the intellect does require the brain. So, for example, people are saying that, you know, that the mind is basically computation. This is garbage. The brain, right, the physical part of us might be computational, right? So the soul, or the living soul, requires the brain in order to do calculations and abstractions and all kinds of things and stuff like that, right? But the fact of the matter is that that there's no area for that in the brain whatsoever, right? And you can't make it happen and all that kind of stuff. So even though the brain is required, and mechanically you can sort of see, well, this neuron fires and you get a signal from here, and you can explore and assess the brain in a very, very mechanical way, and it's something you would expect. And as an engineer, it's something that I would expect as well, of course, right? Because I mean, I work with stuff that uses a computer to drive the machine in very precise movements and things like that. And we see the same principles, that as the more they learn about what the brain and the body does, the more we're seeing, well, yeah, this is like machines and stuff like that. But there's things obviously that simply appealing to a mechanist, the mechanisms just doesn't explain at all, sort of thing. Now, here's a very interesting experiment that has been the source of much. Has been central to much of the talks. This thing keeps failing on me. It was working so well. Pity. I'm gonna need to get another one. Right. So the experiment, Libet experiment. Right. So what did he do? Right. Very, very interesting experiment, and materialists have jumped all over this to say that this experiment shows that we don't have free will, that everything is just metaphysical and it's all just impulses in the brain and all that kind of stuff. So what he did is he said, he got a person and says, right, basically to think about, there's like a little button that they need to press. Right, so what I'll do, like I said before, I will have, this is Benjamin Libet, this is the gentleman over here. So I've got a lot of articles and things like that I will post up for you to have a look at what we're talking about and things like that, just as a matter of interest, sort of thing. So what Libet did is he said to his patients, he said, listen, what we're going to do is we're going to hook you up and everything like that. We're going to measure your brain waves and all these kinds of things, and we're going to try and see what happens when you are performing a task. And basically, he says, there's this button that we need to push you at a particular time, right? And just before you push the button, make a note of when you become aware of the decision to push the button, and then push the button, and we're going to see at what point the brain sort of activates, right? Sort of thing. And what they found was that before the individual, so we're looking at a time difference of 0.5 seconds, right? So 5 milliseconds delay, ms, 5 milliseconds delay, right? 5 milliseconds before the person becomes aware of the decision. So the person's like, I'm going to push the button, and then they push the button, right? 5 milliseconds before they're like, I'm going to push the button, and then push the button, there's a brain spike, what he eventually called the readiness potential, right? And then the push, and so atheists jump on this because here is the cause. Here is what appears to be the causal interaction. So you have a brain. You have a brain wave function. Right? Then, only then do you have the awareness. And then you push the button. So, for the materialist, they say, right, this is happening before you're even aware of it. Therefore, right, your actions are deterministic. It's not your conscious awareness of things that makes you do anything, right? This is their view. Okay, and looking at this, yes, it would appear that way, right? It would appear that way. It seems to be the case. How do we explain it, right? So what Libet then did is he said, hang on, right? What we're going to do, we're going to run the experiment again. And they found this quite consistent. And since his time, right, back in the 50s and 40s and 60s and so on and so forth, right? So you would basically have your brain function, so what he called the readiness potential. And this is the chain of hot readiness potential, right? Then aware, and then button. Right. So this is the causal line, right? So it's the function that's causing the awareness and so on and so forth. It means that the physical, what it means, materialism is true. We've got no free will. Because it's the brain that's telling us what to do it. We merely become aware of what the brain is telling us, and then we do what it's told. So then he says, right, let me run another experiment. And he says, at this point here, right, when you become aware, right, of the to push the button, right, he says, at this point here, decide not to. Right? I'm going to push the button. No, I'm not going to push the button. Right? What he found is that, so basically, this adds another step to the causal chain. So readiness potential, awareness, right? Awareness to push the button. And then one would think that not, right, if this was true, to not comply, you would expect that there would be another readiness potential again. But what they found was silence, nothing. Right? Silence. So once this had all happened, you still had the power to veto the signal. You still had the power to cancel the signal, right? So you have the choice. So what they're finding here is, at this point, you have the choice to either, right? So this down to the button. At this point here, you have the choice to either allow this to continue going, or you have the choice to cancel it out and not do it. Right? So what did he demonstrate with this particular experiment? What he demonstrated is precisely what Christians would expect. Right? That what we have is free, won't. Right? Free won't. Right? So the impulse is delivered to us before we are even aware of it. But once we're aware of the impulse, we then possess the ability to either allow or permit that impulse. Okay? That's what he eventually discovered. Right? Now, there was another experiment. I just want to get to, there was another experiment that basically did a similar thing. However, what they found was that up to 7 seconds, actually incorrect, 7 to 10 seconds before you did something, they could predict, right, that you were going to do it. And this one, the atheists really love. The materialists really love this, but there's a problem. This only had a 55. This is what they don't tell you when they're reporting these things. Only had a 55% rate of success. Right? 50% is random chance. 55% is only slightly better than random chance, which means on that day they got lucky. So if you had to repeat this over and over again, chances are you wouldn't get that result again. So this is nonsense, okay? That's rubbish, first of all, okay? So only about 5 milliseconds. But this idea that 7 to 10 seconds beforehand, the predictive power 7 to 10 seconds beforehand is garbage. Now, why do we as Christians expect this? Right? That we will have, first of all, have free won't. Why would we expect it? Because when we talk about these things, we usually talk about free will, right? But now this falls exactly in line with what we say, or what I say, about the essence, right? And then hypostasis. So that is you, right? That's your essence, and your essence is where the will resides, right? The will is delivered to you, and then it is up to you to either comply or veto. Because the will has become corrupt, what is the Christian's primary duty, right? Self-denial. Self-denial, self-control, etc., 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 right? When we see people who behave, we constantly get irritated when we see people as like, you behave without thinking, you just act on impulse. In fact, many personality disorders are directly linked to impulse control. You have the impulse, and then there's no control. So people who fall into alcoholism, who fall into drug addiction, who fall into sex addiction, etc., 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 are people who have not built up the necessary intellectual power or intellectual prowess to veto the habit, sort of thing, at all. And this is exactly what Christianity expects. The person's will has become corrupt. And now you see this in personality disorders. So personality disorders, right? In personality disorders, you have this massive issue with impulse control. Massive issue with impulse control. Catastrophic, in fact, right? And then you find you have all the drugs and all this kinds of things, so that when the impulse comes in, they've got no power to stop themselves from doing something. So people who get in fights all the time, or shout and scream at each other, and later on they're like, oh, why did I do that? Why did it? Is because you're not exercising your spirit. What happens is, and what a Christian would say is, because you are not exercising your mind. The mind is not being used. If the mind is not being used, what do we say in Christianity? We struggle. Whoops, that's rubbish. We struggle between, right, body and spirit. Spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. We say this all the time. We say this absolutely all the time, right? And now it's of course that's the way it's going to work. It just makes absolutely perfect sense. I was wondering, I was going to talk about some engineering stuff, but I'm wondering if it's even necessary to do that, right? This is absolutely exactly what we would expect, right? We constantly say the mind is willing, but the flesh is weak, right? And what is our thing? To battle against the desires of the flesh, right? And the atheist is only interested in that. That's all he's interested in, right? And the world today is only interested in that. That's all the world is interested in today. Because I want this, and I want that, and I want the next thing, and I must be free to express myself in whatever one manner I choose. And that's what we call mindless. Right? Because even though they say, oh, it's a choice, it's not a choice, right? These experiments actually prove that what the world is doing is not by choice. They're simply following the dictates of their carnal nature, of their baser, lower nature. All of this nonsense where we just go around, sleep with each other, party, do whatever retarded, degenerate stuff that is typical to this world. They say, oh no, it's free choice, man. I want to do whatever I want. It's like, no, you're not doing what you want. You're just simply doing whatever comes to you, and you indulge in it. That's all it is. And it always lands up in problems, destruction. Always lands up in destruction. Every single time, right? And now we understand that that these impulses come to us. There are many disorders that make us understand that these impulses come to us without our willingness to do so. So, for example, if you think about someone that has a condition with intrusive thoughts, right? Talk to anyone that experiences intrusive thoughts. They have these ideas, they have these thoughts sometimes, and they can be atrocious. Go kill that someone, go peel their face off, go and kill yourself, throw yourself off a bridge, go do this and this and this and this. And they're like, I don't want this, right? But these things just keep coming into the brain, and it's actually a problem. What they find is actually sometimes is actually a lot of brain damage and things like that, where the mind, I forget what the brain structure is, but there is a brain structure that is responsible for the shifting of one's attention. Is it the amygdala? I forget now. I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I forget. There's a part of the brain that is responsible for shifting attention, and if this is damaged, the person can't shift their attention, and what happens is they become obsessive. The brain becomes obsessive. An impulse comes through, the person says no, but the brain doesn't then say okay and switch off. It keeps on punching the signal through all the time, and this is what you then have in things like obsessive compulsive disorder, problems with obsessive thoughts, and even things like motor disorders, Tourette's, and various tic disorders, where the brain is acting autonomously, is just firing that signal without ever shifting the signal and stuff, and without the need to prime. So here's the interesting thing, right? In that Libet experiment where he says hit the buttons, so we have the wave, the brain wave, right? The wave, awareness, right? And then the choice to either comply or veto, right? B for button, right? To either comply or veto. Okay. What I would like to see the experimenters do is go behind that, right? Because telling about the person about their experiment is already priming primes the whole system, right? Already primes the whole system. So who primes this? Is it the system itself that primes it, or is it the person who's having the interaction with the person that's giving it, with the individuals giving him the instructions? Right? They should go behind that experiment, right? Behind all of this, right? And they would probably see overall in the body there's some sort of a readiness potential or something there going on, but the mind is, or has already primed the system, so that the system, right? And we see this when we're doing machines and stuff like that, right? So the individual, the person, right, has already primed the system from being given the instructions. Listen, this is what I want you to do, right? And then so then the brain, which is the one responsible for all the motor and stuff like that, the brain is constantly looking for all of the conditions to be met, and you get this the same thing with machines. If you've got a piece of software running on a machine and has the machine to operate, being fed into the system is things like sensors, switches, all kinds of things that are constantly feeding information. And then once all the necessary conditions are met, right? Once all the necessary conditions for an operation are met, you then have the signal, right, to perform the condition. And if at some point, right, and now there's an awareness as well, the machine, even in machine world, there's an awareness. The machine continues to monitor the situation, so if that at any point the conditions are violated, right, if at any point the conditions are violated, like if you have a break in one of the switches or the sensors and stuff like that, it will veto the action, right, or it will then continue to allow the action to go through, right? You get the same thing in machines and stuff like that, but all the way at the back, right, because it needs your attention. The attention of what? The awareness of the individual who's performing the thing, who's making the choice, right? We can simulate this with machines, but the awareness, the conscious awareness of what's going on in the person is different. Because what a lot of people don't realize is that you have then the mind active there, and then you have the mind active over here, right? If you didn't have the mind first there, you wouldn't prime the system in the first place, so that the system is already is ready to activate that, and then to do it, right? The awareness, all the awareness does, the conscious mind does, is either allow or prohibit, right? But you need the mind there as well. Without the mind there and without the mind there, nothing happens at all, right? You don't even get off the ground in the first place. Okay. Now here's the thing. We experience this. So let's say we get a fright. Right? What do we do? What happens if you get a fright? All right. What happens if you get a fright? Well, you've got two solutions. You've either got fight, right? Fight or flight. So in that split second timing, and this is now when we look at this system and we think, well, why would God design the person to be that way? Is because in real world time, if a person has to be consciously aware of every single process and either approve or disapprove each and every single process, then the process is actually too slow, is actually far too slow. And then in the real world, you basically couldn't do anything. If it was necessary for you to focus on every single little thing, right? Think about here's a thought experiment. If the mind, right, the conscious awareness had to focus and determine every single little thing going on, what would you look like? You would look like an infant, right? Think about an infant. An infant is still learning all the coordination, is still learning how to walk, is still learning how to talk, is still learning how to play basketball, how to ride a bicycle. It's still programming the system on how to do all of the things automatically. And this is what a lot of people don't understand, and what the whole field of psychology and neuroscience has discovered, that the vast majority of things you do automatically, right? The only time you don't do it automatically is right at the beginning, when you are first learning how to do something, which is why learning to do something is so awkward and requires a large amount of... So, for example, they've done the neuroscientific studies on this. For example, so if you look at brain activity of a person performing a task, when they are first learning to do the task, the brain activity is very high. It's highly, highly active. But once the person has repeated the task many times, you find that the brain activity decreases by a significant percentage, to the point where it becomes just automatic short firing of the necessary things to do. So, for example, if you've been riding a bike or been driving a car, or whatever the case might be, you don't even think about it anymore. In fact, there are things that we do, what we call force of habit, that when we're not paying attention, let's say you're driving, and most people will do this. The end of the day, work is finished and stuff like that, you're driving home. You're not focused on driving home. Most of your drive home and to work, because it's something you do every day, most of it is on autopilot, right? Most of it is on autopilot. The only time it's not on autopilot is when you see those red tail lights, right, of the car, which is why we have the red tail lights. The red tail lights bring up the readiness potential, right, of the individual, right? So you'll have that, they infiltrate the person, so you have that, sort of signal, red lights, it enters your consciousness, it brings you back, right, from wherever it was that your mind was. It brings you back, and because now you have a situation that is not pre-programmed, it's out of the usual, it's not something you've trained in, right? It's not something you've trained in, and now the body requires the mind to come back to start making decisions in a situation that it has no idea how to automatically deal with, right? Which is why things like driving lessons, like big sort of driving lessons and stuff like that, are actually probably quite beneficial, sort of advanced driving lessons, so that people will react faster, right? The faster you react, the less thought goes into the thing. And it's why, for example, when people talk about things like multitasking and stuff like that, they're like, oh, I can multitask. And even this whole idea that women can multitask better than men is a lot of crock, okay? Everyone is able to multitask, okay? There's only one reason you're able to multitask at all. The only time you're able to multitask is once you've done those particular things so often that they've become automatic operations, that basically the subconscious can take over those operations so that you don't have to think about them. And the only time the conscious mind is brought into the equation is when it needs to deal with something that is not part of the algorithm, right? So if it was a computer, so this is why we know that the mind is not computational, right? Computers will never think, because what happens, a computer runs the algorithm, and as soon as there's an error, what does it do? It throws its hands up and says, I can't go anymore. That's what computers do. They send up an error, okay? Blue screen. That's what a computer does. But that's not what a person does, right? Once the algorithm runs to the end of what it is able to do, right? It brings in the mind so that the mind can then program a new algorithm. So it's like the computer. So that computer model that I was talking about, like when the computers are having the sensors and stuff like that, the computer runs according to the algorithm, but the algorithm is always written by a person. It's always written by a mind. Right? And that's essentially what you're constantly doing. The subconscious is actually very computational. We could probably describe it as very mechanical, right? But the conscious mind is not. The conscious mind is what programs the algorithms that the subconscious runs with in order for things to be easy and efficient, etc., etc., etc. Otherwise we have to focus on every tiny single little thing, and that's where, and we all experience this when you're first learning how to do something, right? When you're first learning how to do something, you've got to devote, and you fumble and you fiddle and whatever until you get used to it. And once you get used to it, right, you can then do it with your eyes closed virtually, right? The eyes can then be closed because the brain just follows it algorithmically, right? Even to the point, like if tennis players and stuff like that, they don't have to think about how far do I need to stretch out for this shot. The body already knows that these things get calculated by the subconscious mind in fractions of a second. It really minute, tiny little details and stuff like that. And the conscious, because the nature of sports is always changing. For the most part it's not, but always there's always an element of uncertainty. You obviously have to be present, and it's there just to make those, and whoever can make those adjustments faster. And that is then when IQ, for example, IQ is in a sense is processing power, and people who have higher, for example, the higher IQ you have, the faster is your processing power, so that delay probably decreases quite substantially the higher the IQ. I reckon it would be actually quite beneficial if they would control for IQ, or see if IQ has a, so for example, people with low IQ are more likely to have in an unusual situation are more likely to have an accident on the road. They respond things differently. They have found that there is a small correlation between reflexes and IQ, right? So now another thing is, like, or if we go back to this, we're talking about so you get a fright, right? Something jumped out at you, whatever the case might be, and the body just automatically reacts, right? So at that point, what are you going to do? Are you going to fight, or are you going to run away? What decides this, right? Even in that second, because it's such a split second thing, what does this? And this is why we know that personality is biological, right? So if we look at our other video, right, the hypostasis or the body, the personality is there, right? So your personality is right, your personality comes, if you look at personality trait theory, you've got your basic 5, right? So you've got openness, you've got conscientiousness, you've got extroversion, you've got agreeableness, and you've got neuroticism, right? So whether you will fight or whether you will flight actually depends a lot on your personality, your biological immediate proclivity for a specific action. So for example, if we look at neuroticism, if you are high in neuroticism, right, your automatic reaction will either be run away or you will freeze on the spot without knowing what to do, right? Because people who are high neuroticism are very, very anxious, and very very fearful, and all of these kinds of things. And you will find that people with high neuroticism, so the readiness potential for fear is almost like it's always on, which is why people with high neuroticism often have a lot of musculoskeletal problems, right, and need a lot of massages and things like that, because they're always tense and stiff, is because their readiness potential for something bad to happen is always on, right? And you get this in machines as well. So certain sensors and switches and stuff like that can either be always on or always off, right, depending on the application. And then in order for a change to happen, the signal either has to be established or the signal has to be broken, depending on what it is. So for example, if you're looking at security, for example, and you want motion detection lasers, so you'll have a laser, and when the laser is broken, when the signal is broken, so that system is always on. When the signal is broken, the alarm sounds, sort of thing. And depending on, so that varies depending on the machine, the application, and so on and so forth, right? So for someone who's very, very high neuroticism, that fear factor, that anxiety factor is always on, basically. And it can be absolutely terrible life to live. So these people which is why these people, for example, take offense very easily. They'll be very easily offended, and they tend to perceive things always as a threat, right? That's their first inclination. So someone like that, right, would have the wave function react with fear. React with fear, react with anxiety. And the mind will have to say, yes, this is dangerous, run away. Or, no, this is not dangerous, stop being an idiot, and whatever the case might be. And it's about having the mind control over your bodily functions and stuff like that. That is a thing. So let's say, even your impulse control, for example, is conscientiousness, right? If your conscientiousness is high, and this conscientiousness is actually very, very interesting. So if you go to conscientiousness, if your conscientiousness is very high, you have impulse control. You've got very, very, very good impulse control. However, that leaves you vulnerable to obsession, interestingly enough, right? So impulse control. So let's say you've got high or low conscientiousness, right? You've got a situation where you're in a pub and stuff like that. Of the two, who's most likely to drink too much? Is the person in low conscientiousness, which is low impulse control. They can't stop themselves. Once that substance is in their system, and the system is and the dopaminergic reward system is saying go, 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 get it, right? The person is unable to veto that impulse, and then they drink too much. It's the same with all kinds of addictions, right? However, on the other hand, of the two, which one is most likely to have obsessive compulsive disorder? Is the person with high conscientiousness. So you'll find that, for example, anorexia, they found was a disease of very, very high achieving women. First of all, women on average are higher in conscientiousness than men. And they found that anorexia was a disease of high achieving women. It's a compulsion thing, and we're not talking about this faux oh, I want to be thin for the beach next week, so I'm basically gonna starve myself. Not that kind of imbecility. That's vanity. So there's a risk on both sides where a disorder. So basically, what happens is, because our natures are fallen, we will find that all of the things we do wrong are essentially a pathology of personality. So if you're too aggressive, for example, let's talk about aggression. So yeah, just to finish that, so usually obsessive is people who are very high, so they're very neat, very orderly, everything's got to be in its same place. And then obviously so a person who's high in conscientiousness will be very neat and tidy. Everything has its place. And a person then with obsessive compulsive disorder is like the things can't even touch because they're contaminated. So even the food on their plate all has to be separated and partitioned, to the point that until the requirements are met, the brain doesn't free them up to then proceed with something else. It's very, very, very interesting. So and the individual's mind can see that what they're doing is absurd, right? The mind is looking at this and says, I can't help it, but so they don't want to do it. The desire to do it is not there, but this compunction is so strong that it's really, really, really hard work for someone with OCD and people with all these kinds of things they have to devote a lot of mental mind energy in order to not behave in these kinds of ways. So there's dangers wherever you look. Then let's look at extroversion. There we go. Extroversion. If a person's very, very high in extroversion, they will most likely fight, right? Because extroversion, one of the sub categories of extroversion, the sub traits, is assertiveness. A person who's very, 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 very high in assertiveness. And then also, if we look here at agreeable, so high in assertiveness and low in agreeableness, in this situation, that person will fight, right? Just automatically. Okay? But now, here's the thing. At any given moment, At any given moment, one of these two is correct and one of these two is wrong. Sometimes you shouldn't fight, you should just run. Sometimes you shouldn't run, you should fight, depending on what the issue might be, right? And it is the mind that then has to adjudicate between the two. Once awareness of the situation has kicked in, right, then the mind, the consciousness, has to adjudicate, do I actually fight in this situation, or do I run away? Or do I run away, or should I rather fight? And we're constantly telling people to manage these kinds of things. Let the mind go and gain control and mastery of yourself, which is then why disciplines like meditation and so on and so forth come in, because it's the discipline of the mind to then go a discipline of the mind over the body, over the automatic functions of the physical body. Right, so this is basically how it sort of plays out. And then you find, so for example, when the nature, right, so if we say that these are biological, right, that this is biological, this is your automatic response to things. So do you automatically get offended by everything? We will see that in your personality profile. Are you too aggressive for no reason? We'll see that in your personality profile. Are you constantly coming up with completely wacky ideas? That'll be your that'll be your personality profile. And another thing, right, for example, so what does the Bible talk about? It talks about stewardship. Stewardship, right? Stewardship over what? Over the body, right? So this is how you look after the body, what you eat and what you do with your body. Don't engage in too much promiscuity is bad for you. Gluttony, things of that sort, is you've got to look after the body. Why? So for example, we know, let's say someone is very, very low in openness, right? Someone is very low in openness. So people who are low in openness are said to be very narrow-minded. It's very difficult to present them with evidence or an argument or an idea and have them change their minds and accept this and accept it, right? So one of the best examples for lack of free will would be as someone who's very, very narrow-minded, because no matter what you do, the stubborn son of a gun won't change his mind. Okay, now first of all, over time, as you get older, so personality is stable over time. Very, very, very stable over time, right? But they do change slightly, right? But the reason why we say we're stable, so for example, let's say neuroticism, right? You decrease in neuroticism over time, but someone who's high in neuroticism to begin with, even though it decreases over time, they will always be higher than someone who was initially low in neuroticism, for example. So even though it does change over time as our bodies change, as we mature and all of these kinds of things, right? Which is why, for example, extroversion goes down, so assertiveness goes down the older you get, which is why old men are less likely to get into a fist fight than teenagers, for example, right? Lower assertiveness peaks in the late teens, early 20s, okay? Early to mid 20s, that's the highest peak of assertiveness. That's where most criminality happens and all that kind of stuff. Peak of assertiveness and lowest point of neuroticism for young males. So there's no fear, they just go and do stupid things and they don't think about consequences and stuff like that. So but we see that as our bodies age, and this is why we can see that a lot of this is physical, right? Changes over time. And obviously if you affect your body with what you eat and whether you meditate and whether you're healthy or not, you're gonna affect this, and and so if you have any personality pathologies, the condition of your health, the condition of your body can aggravate those pathologies, can actually make it worse. For example, so if someone who is low in agreeableness, for example, if they consume too much alcohol, then their low agreeableness makes them even more disagreeable, makes them even more likely to get into fights and arguments and things of that sort. And so we understand that physical substances can then change our personalities so that we aggravate sort of thing, which is why the Bible says stay away from alcohol, stay away from certain kinds of foods, fast, meditate and all of these kinds of things, all of the spiritual disciplines that we talk about, these things are very important. So let's go back to openness. So openness, a person who's low in openness is what we call narrow-minded. They're not open to new ideas, they're not open to new experiences, etc., etc. However, if we give them psilocybin, which comes from magic mushrooms, we notice a significantly higher so basically, if you give them psilocybin, then you have massive increase in openness, right? And it seems like the effect is permanent. So for example, they've looked at using psilocybin in treating sort of drug and alcohol addictions and stuff like that, and they found that it's been quite successful and stuff like that. And one of the interesting things is that openness to new ideas, new experiences and stuff like that. So people who are high in openness, so basically if you're watching this video, chances are you are either medium to high in openness, right? Because you want to learn something, you want to chat, you know, you're interested in new ideas and thinking about sort of stuff, right? Will be very creative. So if you're very creative, chances are you're high in openness, but actual creativity, not a cat, not you know, putting paint on your cat's paws and letting your cat run around the canvas. No, right? So by creative means novel, original, useful, right? Useful is a big part of creativity sort of thing. So people who invent cell phones, who invent televisions, who invent cars, who invent things like that, very high in openness and stuff like that. And if you give a person psilocybin, it seems like they have a dramatically increased rate of openness, and it seems to be permanent, that it stays that way. And you usually find, again, that explains why, probably, if you look at shamanic traditions, sort of pagan religions, they tend to use substances quite a lot in terms to communicate with the spirits, and to, so your most religious people are usually using psilocybin to, it makes people more open to religious experience and religious thought and all of these kinds of things. It's actually quite interesting. But again, it shows that even though it increases openness, it doesn't increase intellect. So for example, I have seen people, and you get this a lot. So if you go into the New Age, for example, you see people who will take psilocybin and things of that sort and have these religious experiences and stuff like that, because it actually probably makes your openness too much. So probably what it does, your brain automatically filters out certain information and only allows through what is relevant. Okay, so that information is filtered through your personality and various other things. What happens with psilocybin is it removes all the barriers, which is why you like can taste colors and things like that, because it just opens the floodgates and stuff like that. But what happens is, how you can tell that that doesn't affect the intellect, because the person, while now they are open, they're high in openness, so they're more open to new ideas and new experiences and stuff like that. Their ability to assess those things logically and coherently does not improve, right? So the person's mind, so they become more open, but the mind does not become improved at all. So which is why you find a lot of these people, like for example in your spiritualist movements, your New Age, they have all of these religious experiences. Some of them go from atheism to some kind of spiritualism, but then the philosophical theories within those systems of spiritual belief are completely retarded and incoherent, totally just, and half the time when you ask them to explain their religious they can't explain it at all. It's just gibberish. They simply take it on faith, and they imagine themselves to be very, very enlightened people. I've met my share of these individuals who one trip and now they think they're basically divine. They think they're the next Buddha, kind of thing. It's actually quite irritating. So if we go back to when I was talking about, so remember your essence and your hypostatus. So your essence. So if we take all of that, so basically your essence, so this is your physical body, your essence, right, your human essence sort of hits that and then manifests in different ways, right? Depending on how you're biologically set. And then when the Bible says, lean not on your own understanding, it's like, yes, you have a certain understanding based on what you naturally are, but also your first automatic reactions are not always the correct ones, which is why you need to practice self-control. Sometimes your first reaction is correct, sometimes it's not. When this is part of the socialization process, it's part of the maturing process and stuff like that. And all of these kinds of things where we essentially are asked to take mastery and take control over ourselves. So the idea that that we are completely material is nonsense. I believe is disproved by these findings and all of these kinds of facts. But then also the idea that the body is irrelevant, right, to the point where we can eat and drink and do whatever we want to ourselves is then also incorrect, which is why actually no matter what religion you are involved in, every religion that I'm aware of has traditions that emphasize, depending on the outcomes that you want, that emphasize certain types of diet and things like that. For example, just the other day I had a conversation with an individual where we were talking about Hinduism, and Hinduism, for example, where he was like, Hinduism teaches veganism and all that kind of stuff. And that's actually false. What Hinduism teaches is that there are basically three sort of properties to an individual, and depending on your profession, you should eat according to that. You should eat in order to support that. So they've got a utilitarian view of meat eating and so on. So for example, if in the old Hindu traditions, if you were a soldier, for example, or if your work was very, very physically demanding, they would say eat a lot of meat in your diet to support that. But for their priests and your scholars, they would then recommend a vegetarian, vegan diet to sustain that sort of thing. So this idea that Hindus have always taught veganism in the way that it is today is not true. They've got a utilitarian, if this then that, but essentially they've recognized that food has an influence, and you see this in Hinduism, you see it in Buddhism, you see it in Christianity, you see it in Judaism, you see it in all religions that have recognized that what you eat will influence your personality, influence your character, and all of these kinds of things. And the Seventh-day Adventists, my denomination, have been saying that also for years, that we need to be temperate and practice good stewardship over what we eat and over our health, because that will actually influence you either for good and for better spiritual life and better spiritual living, or it will influence you for evil, to the point where you will actually then find yourself with a greater proclivity for sin and all of that kind of stuff. And so by regulating your health really, really helps you mitigate all that sort of thing, which is then, we believe that Satan has basically taken hold of the food industry and made these kinds of issues then come out in the world. And we see that with the degeneration of human beings, we get a commensurate degeneration of the food supply, and we see that we see that everywhere, sort of thing. And yeah, there's a lot more that can actually be said about this sort of thing, but the idea, that the mind and that obviously on the Christian view, obviously the brain is important, the physical brain is important, but to say that the brain and the mind are identical is nonsensical, right? There is absolutely no reason why any Christian should fear the revelations of neuroscience and stuff like that. In fact, they should find it intriguing, they should study it and all these kinds of things. But basically, science validates the idea that the mind and the brain are not identical at all. They rely on each other, right? There is an interaction between the two, and there's a dependence, which Christians would expect, because we are not merely spiritual, we are physical as well. And in our resurrection, we will have bodies, so we will have a new heaven and a new earth. We are going to live in the hereafter in a physical world, right? The Bible talks about the lamb lying with the wolf and all these kinds of things, right? We're going to see that there's still going to be animals, there's still going to be nature, we're going to climb trees, we're going to eat fruit and all these kinds of things, even afterwards, in the resurrection we're going to live physical lives. Okay, so the the idea. So when people, so anyone that says anything other than the physical and the metaphysical are anything other than a very tight intertwining of the physical and the metaphysical aspects of human beings, anything other than that is just false and is not supported by the literature. And Christianity would recognize that, obviously, that materialism is false, and that any elements of complete total spiritualism, which you find in Christianity as well. A lot of Christians are like, you know, when you die, off goes your soul, and there you are as a conscious being without a body. It's rubbish. That's it makes the concept of a resurrection completely redundant, and all of that sort of thing. It's you know, when we so basically what happens is, you know, when we die, and this again is my thesis, right, we've got breath and dust, right, and then the two make living soul. LS, make living soul. So if you take away that one, you die, and if you take away that one, you die, sort of thing. So when you die, usually it's because this one fails you, right? Because obviously that one can't fail you, because this is from God. This is God's divine power, right? God is the source of life, so this won't fail you, right? Which God gave to Adam, the breath of life that Adam has communicated from generation to generation until us. So what happens is when we die, this is what fails us, and then this goes back to God, right? And then this falls asleep, right? You're asleep in the grave, and you wait for the resurrection, right? The Bible constantly calls death asleep. Death is asleep. There's no conscious. So again, if you watch my video, What the Hell, you'll see my thesis, how it works on this, and all of this together with the science, with it's very it all makes sense, makes perfect sense. It is exactly what Christians or it's exactly what I would expect and what Christianity would expect. Absolutely 100%. And there's no reason to be afraid of these revelations at all. And so yeah, that's it, you know. So that Libet experiment, whilst very interesting, you have that readiness potential and stuff like that, there's a lot more that could be said, and it must be said, not all atheists are saying so. For example, Daniel Dennett of the new atheists, he's probably the most rational of all of them, which makes sense because of all of them he's the only philosopher. The rest are good scientists in their own right, but philosophically incompetent, essentially. But you know, he looks at the Libet experiment and he's like, no, it does not prove materialism, not by any stretch, even though he himself is a materialist, right? And that's how fair he is being, is that he's like, even though he himself is a materialist and he's being an atheist and all that kind of stuff, he looks at these experiments and he doesn't conclude what the same thing that many atheists have, that means that, because he also says there's a whole bunch of other things that could be going on, and I would definitely agree with that, you know. So the speed of the connectivity of the neurons, all kinds of factors that come into play, one would still need to ask questions about, and all of that sort of thing that is so far we're not in actually a position to answer. And also, even if you take presuppositionalism, and even though I enjoy, again, let me say I like presuppositionalism, I think presuppositionalism and classical arguments are complementary, they should both be used, sort of thing. But if you take presuppositionalism, I mean, if an atheist wants to say that you can actually take the worldview of materialism and reduce it to absurdity, so that even a priori, so before all of the knowledge about this issue has come in, you can just in terms of taking what he says, what materialism has to say, you can reduce it to complete and utter absurdity. I mean, I literally had an argument with a guy the other day who doesn't believe in free will, and yet he continued to try and change my mind. It's like, you know, it's like, we don't have free will. He's like, are you sure? Yeah, I don't think we have free will. And I'm like, yeah, well, I do think we have free will. And he's like, yeah, well, let me try and change your mind. So it's like, come on. It's like, you know, and he just couldn't realize it, you know. And that's when a presuppositional argument is very useful in a situation like that, where someone's worldview does not give them, basically denies the very thing that they are doing, right? Which is, if materialism is true, if free will is true, then the very act of having conversation it denies your ability to have a conversation, to do that, right? You are not having a conversation, you are not deciding anything, you are not voluntarily engaging in anything, you haven't thought anything, you haven't rationalized it, you haven't done anything, right? Because a computer, so you essentially basically nothing but computational. So basically, in that view, right, what an algorithm does, imagine an algorithm is almost like a railroad, right? Like a railroad sort of thing, right? And then the railroad can veer off in different avenues. So that's what an algorithm is like. That's what computation is like, right? Like a train can only go where there are rails, right? And if it comes off the rails, what happens? There's a catastrophe, error, right? That is what, if materialism is true, right? And if the brain is a computer, then increasing computational power, speed, etc., all it means is that the train can move faster along the tracks and can navigate more complex deviation, can navigate more complex junctions and things of that sort, but it can never depart from the tracks, right? So if materialism is true, we're like trains. But if materialism is not true, we're more like off-road doom buggies, right? Where you can go anywhere that you want, sort of thing. And the truth of the matter is that the mind-brain dichotomy, one is like a train, the subconscious is can functions like a train algorithmically, you do things automatically and stuff like that. And you've got both. So in the mind-brain interaction, you actually have both. You have the train that plods along and does all of your daily routines for you automatically, so that you are efficient, and whatever you're well practiced in and all that kind of stuff, you run algorithmically. That's fine. But every now and then you come to a dead end in the tracks, and then you need to get off the train and you need to get on a doom buggy and you need to go explore. Right, off you go into your off-road vehicle, and you need to go and explore and leave the tracks behind, right? That is what the mind is there for. And the mind does not function algorithmically. And if the mind does not function algorithmically, it means that computers will never, ever, ever be able to think. Right? Computers will never be like humans, no matter how much you increase computational power. It's simply because the mind is not a computer. In fact, the mind is very, very opposite of what a computer is. Because, for example, like we say, the only time that machines will ever have true AI is when the machine is able to function non-algorithmically. So non-algorithmically, right? That's the only time. So you actually have tests, right? So for example, when you're talking about machines and when you're talking about artificial, you've got two tests. You've got the Turing test, right? Turing test, right? And then you've got another one. You've got the Lovelace test. And many people have actually not heard about this, right? So this is by Alan Turing, and this is by a lady, I forget her name, but her surname was Lovelace. I forget the lady's name. So basically the Turing test, we have actually had machines that have passed the Turing tests, which means that a sufficiently sophisticated AI can actually still pass the Turing test, right? But what the Lovelace test requires for true AI, so we would say this is weak AI, right? Weak AI. The Lovelace test would be strong AI. So what's the difference? The Lovelace test basically says, you know that a computer has gained consciousness when it does something that is unexpected, and when you look into the code, the code is unable to account for what the machine is doing, right? For what the algorithm. So it's an extra phenomenal thing on top of what has been programmed, right? So the Turing test. We can still, if the computer in a Turing machine, if the computer does something that is unexpected, right? We are able to look at the algorithms and see in the algorithms, okay, that's why it did that, right? That is why it did that. Whereas in the Lovelace test, if the computer does something unexpected, let's say you've built a true Android, right? You would then go in there and you would look at all of the coding and stuff like that, and there would be nothing in the programming, in the algorithms, that would tell you why it did what it did. It's like an extra outside phenomenon, and this is exactly what we see in the human mind, right? So, for example, when you've got breath and dust, right? Breath and dust, okay, and you've got living soul, right? So you can analyze that as much as you want to, which is like analyzing the algorithms. It will never explain why this exists. Never do it. Never ever do it, right? You might be very complicated. You will gain enormous, spectacular insights and incredible understanding, but that's essentially what it is. By looking, you cannot reduce the system, right? And that's what the Lovelace test would expect. When you do when you look at the computer's algorithms, the hardware and the software of the computer are unable to explain why the machine has done what it has done, right? So that what the machine has done is not reducible to the code, the algorithm, or the hardware, or anything, right? It's not reducible, right? And so that is essentially when you have a combination like this, right? This phenomena cannot be reduced. It's impossible to reduce it to only that. Completely impossible, right? Because this is a result of two different things, right? So if you're only looking at the one, and that is then where the fallacy comes in, that is only is only dust. It's not, right? It's absolutely not. And that's why atheists they're never going to get it, because they deny that, completely deny that. And they're philosophically required to, and they denied a priori, right? They denied a priori. It's a worldview. It's presupposed, which is why presuppositionalism even though a lot of people have a problem with it, presuppositionalism is relevant, because presuppositionalism is able to go into a person's worldview and detect what their presuppositions are, so that you can get them at their presuppositions and say, does your construction actually give you what you are saying it gives you, right? And that's basically what we see. And so this idea that we're going to have computers surpassing human beings and stuff like that is not true. It's not true at all. It will never happen, right? Unless the only time you should worry about computers, the only reason why you should worry about the advance of technology is because there are evil idiots that are in control of these systems, right? That is the only reason. So you have to fear the human element in it. You don't have to fear the AI itself, right? Because the AI, like I said, can only do what it has been programmed to, right? And the only time, so in the Turing test, again, when we say that the AI does something unexpected, it's only because of our inability to foresee what the algorithm will produce, right? So it's not because it's actually done something unexpected. It's unexpected because we were short-sighted. But when we look at the algorithm, we can see, oh, this piece of code is there. That's why it did that. And it was simply a pathway that we didn't realize was available to the computer, right? And so, yeah, so those are the kinds of concepts that you're basically dealing with when it comes to the whole metaphysical and physical interaction and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, so anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that was very interesting for you. And yeah, I hope that helps. Thank you very much. Cheerio and goodbye.